Disbeliefs of any sort at all. It's interesting, as Arthur Miller has just pointed out, that the Christian faith is such a significant theme in American public life today. Because when this country declared its independence in 1776, it also enshrined in law that the church and state should be completely separate. The very first president of the United States, George Washington, for example, was a very unenthusiastic churchgoer who always walked out of the service before the congregation took the sacraments. And when the rector of the church admonished him for this, Washington accepted that his sudden departure might, after all, seem to be a bad example, and so he subsequently never bothered to attend the church at all. And the presidents who closely followed him in that office were often on record as being considerably less than devout Christians.
God is an essence we know nothing of. Until this awful blasphemy is got rid of, there will never be any liberal science in the world. The clergy believe that any power confided in me will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe rightly. I have seldom met an intelligent person whose views were not narrowed and distorted by religion. My earlier views on the unsoundness of the Christian scheme of salvation have become clearer and stronger with advancing years.
Judging by the standards set by George Bush Sr., it seems doubtful if any of these great American presidents would have been considered for, let alone voted into office today. All the same, it would be wrong to suggest that the United States is now an uncomfortable place for atheists. I feel entirely at home here, and I'm more often than not in the company of people who have no faith and no time for the officially sanctioned sacred patriotism. For them, as for me, the tenets of and the conflicts between the great faiths, even at their most frightening, are still faintly ridiculous. I just feel Jews and Christians, because they both take origin from the same crackpot sandstorm experience, are shackled together like Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier in that movie.
But not as good looking.
But not nearly as good looking, either of them, you know. I mean, I feel that anti-Semitism, which I deplore, is the result of the fact that there are two loony notions, Judaism and Christianity. You know, that once you get religions hatched in a sandstorm, that holy land, which I always felt whenever I visited, was simply the largest outdoor lunatic asylum in the world.
There's a wonderful Randy Newman line, and I think it's called The God Song, which goes, "There were a bunch of fools in the desert with nothing else to do, so they invented me and they invented you," and it's sung by God.
I mean, I always feel when I look at Christianity in England, the reason why I feel relatively indifferent to it is lost its power. I mean, it's so desperately keen to solicit support that they're willing to throw God out of the window in order to retain it. I mean, God, for many of the Anglicans, is nothing more than a sort of awkward geriatric relative kept upstairs who might be embarrassingly come downstairs incontinently and cause trouble. The Anglican Church in England is astoundingly moderate and accommodating. All the same, there's still a faint feeling that atheism is best kept under wraps. There's a kind of fastidious distaste about admitting it, for reasons which are really quite hard to identify. It was here in Cambridge that I became an undergraduate more than 50 years ago, and I was surrounded by the architectural symbols of the Christian heritage. By the time I came here, I had already decided to study medicine, and although it's difficult and I think rather misleading to make a simple equation between science and disbelief, the biological sciences with which I was already acquainted left very little room for religious considerations. All the same, when you walk around these ancient buildings, the images and architecture of Christianity are inescapable and undeniably beautiful. But of course, obviously, we have the crucifixion as the climax. All the events leading up to the crucifixion on the left-hand side, and then the events after the crucifixion start here. Now let me see, what have we got? This, of course, is the entombment. And then this is a sequence which, of course, is not mentioned in the Gospels, but this is the harrowing of hell, the anastasis, when Jesus goes down into hell, breaks open the doors, and he brings Adam and Eve out from hell. So we move on, and there, of course, is his appearance in front of doubting Thomas, and Jesus offers him his wounded side and invites the skeptical disciple to place his hands in the wound, and so on and so forth. This whole sequence here is concerned with the events leading up to and after the resurrection. This culminates, of course, in the ascension, and you could just see the disappearing feet of Christ at the top of the window there as he vanishes into the heavens. Now these, of course, are stories and events which are deeply buried inside the imagination of any literate European. I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe the divinity of any of this, but I would be very impoverished if I didn't have these in my imagination. It would be a very thin form of life which didn't have these images. It would be a mistake to think that my scientific training as an undergraduate confirmed my pre-existing disbelief in the existence of God. Many of my medical colleagues, after all, were pious Christians. No, the fact is that it was my exposure to modern linguistic philosophy which helped me to distinguish between my belief in genes or atoms, things which you never see directly, and my disbelief in supernatural entities such as gods or spirits. The point is that philosophy, right from the outset, has concerned itself with the nature of existence itself, with what might or might not exist. With thoughtfulness, and above all with literacy, thoughts themselves become subjects of discussion in a way that they wouldn't have been before they were written down. It's not until they're written down that they become stable enough to bear examination in the same way that physical objects themselves can bear examination. And indeed, philosophy as such doesn't really emerge until literacy occurs, and even then not conspicuously until the Greeks, who start to question the nature of reality itself. And it's with the philosophy of the ancient Greeks that we finally get to what you might call the deep end in our examination of the history of disbelief. Well, here we are in the midst of the Elgin marbles at the British Museum. It's an hour or two before the public floods in, and I find myself wondering what they'll make of these artifacts, retrieved as they've been from a civilization with which we really have